Today's video is a continuation of the problem solving framework that I was sharing last week with you guys. It's a secret framework which none of the consulting companies will train you with unless you have made it inside. So imagine all the wonders that you can do with it if you know it beforehand while solving the cases. Hi everyone, welcome to Insider Gyan. My name is Somi. I am an IIT Delhi and ISB Hyderabad grad and I have been working in consulting for 8+ years. On this channel, I share a lot about my career experiences, a lot about consulting cases. I have a lot of case studies, how to solve them, etc. on this channel. But today we are going to go through a problem solving framework, which is the part 2 of last week's video. To recap shortly, last week हमने discover किया that problem solving has 4 key steps: defining the problem, identifying the issues and developing hypotheses, data analysis, and lastly summarizing the recommendations. In last week's video, we already covered how to define the problem in a correct way and how to identify issues and develop hypotheses. And we also took an example of a growth strategy case which we are going to follow through into this video. I am also going to recap the 4 hypotheses from last week's video because that is going to be very important to carry through for this part 2 as well. Actually, the problem statement we had was how to make our client grow by 10% by the year 2025. And the issues and hypotheses that we identified were 4. Number 1 is maybe the industry itself is not growing at 10% and that's why our client is not growing at 10%. Number 2, maybe the customer preferences have changed, which is why they're not buying from our client. Number 3, maybe competitors are doing something better, maybe in marketing or in branding or in pricing, and they're grabbing share from our client. Number 4, maybe there are some internal issues with our client in supply chain or inventory management, which is why they are not able to meet the demand of the customers. So those were the 4 hypotheses. Now moving to step 3 of the problem solving framework, which is the data analysis part. So data analysis is the actual case solving part where that in a consulting case, we will usually spend most time on. There are 3 parts to it. Based on the hypotheses that we have defined, part number 1 is to identify what data you will need. Number 2 is actually to go onto the ground and collect that data. And lastly, it's actually doing whatever analysis you have to do. It can be qualitative data, it can be quantitative data. So the analysis that you do for qualitative is obviously going to be very different from the analysis that you do in quantitative. So let's now go back to our example and see कि each hypothesis के लिए what are some of the data points that we'll need. Hypothesis number 1, industry itself is not growing as high. To prove or disprove this hypothesis, we'll obviously need the industry growth data. We can also do with some of the big competitors in our field. What is their growth data? How is the market landscape in general? So on and so forth. This is the kind of data that we will need for hypothesis 1. For hypothesis 2, which is maybe your customer preferences have changed. You need to deep dive into who your customers actually are. What are their trigger points? What are their drivers? What about your product captivated them in the past? Has anything changed in their lifestyle or something else in the market which might have changed their preferences? What were some of the selling propositions earlier? Now, these are the kind of data that you will need to prove or disprove hypothesis 2. Hypothesis 3, if competitors are snatching your product, this is where you have to deep dive on your competitors. Understand who your competitors really are. What is their marketing strategy? What are the products that they have in the market? Do they have any differentiating parts in their differentiating features in their product versus the product that you have currently? What is the price of their product? What is their value proposition? So on and so forth. Basically, for this, you will need to benchmark all your products and strategies against competitors. So it's a competitor benchmarking, and that's all the data that you will need. Hypothesis 4, if there's some issue with your own supply chain or own operations, this is where you will do a deep dive into your own company, try to understand inventory, try to understand customer demand and supply, try to go and see each steps of the distribution channel you have. Is there a bottleneck in the distribution channel which is impacting the flow of products, so on and so forth. Basically, internal data is what you will need for this hypothesis. Moving to second part, how to get the data. Now, how to get the data obviously will depend on the type of data that you will need. If it is some quantitative data, then of course you can use a lot of databases that exist. You can do secondary research as well. You can, for some of the qualitative data, you might want to think about doing actual primary research, like identifying your customers, selecting a subset and maybe interviewing them. You can also, to know about the competitors, you can also do expert interviews. For example, someone with 20 years of experience, maybe they have worked in your client's industry across 3 or 4 companies, and you can have a chat with them and see what their thoughts are about the market or about their competitors. And data gathering is honestly the longest and the biggest, most time-consuming part of any kind of consulting project. Lastly, you will do the analysis. So analysis is obviously a little bit of science and art driven. So if there's a lot of quantitative data that you have, then it will need a little different kind of skill sets like data visualization, data analysis, etc. Versus if you have qualitative data, then it's a little simpler. It's more about structuring that data and finding the pain points that come out of that data basically. Now moving to the last part of the problem solving framework, which is recommendations. Hopefully by now you would have done data analysis and you would have proved or disproved some of the hypotheses that you have. Say for instance, out of the 4 hypotheses that you had, 2 of them you were able to prove using the data, and the other 2 hypotheses were wrong. They could not be validated. So which means that your recommendations are going to be based on the first 2 hypotheses which you were able to prove. So obviously your recommendations are also going to be based on which hypotheses you managed to prove. For instance, if hypothesis 1 was proved, which is industry is not growing as fast. Now, if your client still has to grow at a 10% rate, the only option for them is to try and venture into other industries which are higher growth. So they have to diversify their offerings somehow. If hypothesis 2, which is customer preferences have changed, has been proved, in that case, you will have to look at your product and you have to include the preferred customer features into your product somehow. Or maybe you can just go into the market and acquire a new company which is providing a product which is exactly similar to what your customers want. Again, for hypothesis 3, which is competitor issue, if you see that competitors are doing something better, then you have to relook at your own strategies, or you can, if you are being very aggressive, you could just go ahead and try to acquire that competitor so that those strengths could be inculcated into your company. And if it's the last issue, which is some issues with your inventory or supply chain, then you will have to find out what solutions you could bring in. Like if the suppliers are not able to provide you raw materials fast enough, then somehow you will have to increase your suppliers or acquire new suppliers or talk to new suppliers. Or if there's a problem in your own flow chain or distribution channel, then you have to tackle the problem accordingly. Now the next step in recommendations is obviously not to just stop at this recommendation. In a proper real consulting case, you will go one step forward and also provide them an execution plan and timeline and maybe a business case, how much the company will have to invest to be able to grow by 10% by 2025. So those were the 4 steps of problem solving. Hope you guys have a much better understanding, and if you go back and look at some of the case studies that we have done in the past on this channel or from any other case books, you will see that all of these cases inherently have a very similar kind of an approach as well. There's a data collection phase. Of course, a real consulting case versus a case interview में difference ये हो जाता है कि आपकी data availability in a case interview is much lesser, the level of detail you will go into is much lesser, so on and so forth. But otherwise, it's very like parallel kind of a comparison. Hope you guys liked this video. If you did, please hit the like button, and if you have any other video ideas or recommendations, drop them in the comments. For whatever reason, if you haven't subscribed to the channel, please do so, and I'm going to see you in the next one. Till then, bye.